when people of differing ethnic backgrounds go to the same school and work in the same society, if we encourage people to retain their ethnicity and their religious foundations, are we not producing a divisive society? Now, some of these new academies are causing problems. I don't refer only to Islamic schools, but I refer to the whole issue of whether these academies, in which my son-in-law teaches in London, if these academies are allowed to do as they will, without rules and regulations from the rest of society, and this is a political issue now, is it not that we will produce a more divided society? So the other side of what I argue is you retain your ethnicity in the Christian faith in Christ, and other faiths have the right and obligation to retain their own identities. But if we in a society allow everybody to retain their difference, we then have the obligation to recognize the commonality of the society in which we live. And that means accommodation, that means relating to people of other faiths. They have the right to be different, but we also all have the obligation to accommodate one another to produce a peaceful society. And that, I think, is a big issue for forgiveness and self-understanding in schools.
But in order to create the kind of environment to teach around forgiveness, the first thing we have to do is to have opportunities to understand ourselves and understand others and understand our interconnectedness. And if we don't have that space to explore those three things, I think we can't really go anywhere with concepts such as forgiveness. And so I'm a very strong advocate of supporting educational establishments to do that kind of work, which then leads to things like rights and responsibilities, but it comes from a place of really deep knowing. But the pilot work that we've done, again, using people's stories to encourage young people to explore their own identity, and by that I mean not only who I am, but where I've come from. The very first comments at the beginning of the day were wonderful. What are the three most important things we need to know? Where have you come from? Where are you going? And what are you here for? And it's so true. And I think those really obvious questions often get completely overlooked in our education system, and yet they're so important. So doing the resource that we have developed is using people's stories, and they're often very powerful stories of forgiveness that people have embarked on, and they're all completely different, they're all completely individual. There are no conclusive definitions of what forgiveness is. But what they do is help young people then to explore their own understandings and to really start to engage with very complex issues around compassion, around empathy. I mean, all the different words that we've been using. And we're all wrestling constantly with, is it possible to forgive that particular thing that's happened to me? We all carry those stories. So once we're adults and professionals with responsibility for young people, we're carrying our stories into that space. And whether we like it or not, we are transmitting our attitudes towards those issues. And they'll come out, whether it's just sorting out the dispute with Janet and Jane in the classroom, or whether it's actually through a specific lesson in RE or history around the Holocaust, or whatever it is, it will come out. So how much better is it if we can do it consciously and admit as professionals that it's something that we actually wrestle with constantly in our own private lives, and that it's something that we acknowledge is a complex issue and that we all have to learn to embrace it. I think that has to happen on both a personal and a collective level. I'm not sure about the distinction between justice being the public domain and forgiveness being the private domain. And I have real concerns about societies where they're divided, where justice has to prevail in order to keep the peace. And I understand why that happens, but I worry that for the generations growing up in that environment, all it does is create a continuation or a repetition of the ignorance of the other, which then gives rise to renewed suspicion, which can escalate into hatred, and rocks get lobbed over the walls that we build, don't they? And so I'm not sure about that at all.
think the longer I'm on my journey, the less I know what forgiveness is. And so it's a word that I rarely use. I was going to share a little bit of my story and then make some points of what I'm learning. And what I'm learning is changing all the time. When my father was killed in the Brighton bomb in 1984, it was very important for me to start a journey, and that journey involved understanding the people who killed my father, which was the IRA. And I wanted to create something positive out of what had happened. And that journey started within 2 days. It wasn't that I forgave in 2 days, it was I started a journey with tiny steps to find a way to bring something positive to this appalling trauma. And I wanted to find a way to not blame, to not be resentful, to not go for revenge. And I didn't know anybody else who was making that journey at that time. Now I know people all around the world, but I didn't back in 84. And so I saw that was part of me that wanted to be revengeful and to blame and have an enemy. And there was another part that wanted to take responsibility and end the cycle of violence and revenge. It seemed clear that one way to really understand the people who killed my father was actually to meet the man who'd planted the bomb. I had to wait a long time for that. It was when we had the Good Friday Peace Agreement and the peace process, and Patrick McGee was released from prison in 1999. And so I arranged to meet him in a private house in Dublin in the year 2000. And it was very scary for me, and I spent a lot of time being with my emotions, a lot of emotional preparation. I'd gone through a lot of raging and grieving and acknowledging my sorrow, and I'd found a place where I could do that safely. And I thought I wasn't ready, but I was ready enough to meet him. And my purpose was to see the human being. I didn't want to just see him as the terrorist, just to define him as his action of planting the bomb that killed my father. So I went there to see the human being. And I went to listen. And the first hour and a half, Pat would have been giving me the political justifications and a lot of the theory, and also shared about what was happening in his community at the time when he joined the IRA. And I was actually quite familiar with that, and I wasn't surprised at all. But I was curious, what was beneath that? So I carried on listening and asking questions. And after about an hour and a half, he stopped talking and he said, I don't know anymore who I am. I don't know what to say. I want to help you, and can I hear your rage and your anger? And after that, we had a very different conversation because he'd taken off the political hat and he'd gone further than his label, and he'd become vulnerable and a human being. And he would later say that he was disarmed by the fact that I gave him empathy, and that if I'd stayed or if I'd arrived in a position of I'm right and you're wrong, that would have been a lot easier for him. And so he began a journey as well, and I carried on my journey, and that was in 2000, and we've now spoken and shared together, worked together, 130 times, maybe more. So what have I learned, and what can this be applied to our work in education? I've certainly learned that any kind of labelling stops us from creating a culture of compassion and empathy. I've learned that if I had lived Pat's life, if I had gone through everything he'd been through, would I have made those same decisions? I don't know. And in that moment, it isn't even about forgiveness. That's not actually relevant. It's just about understanding. And understanding is a word I find much easier to explain what I'm doing, or even empathy. I'm working with a school in America with this project, which has been started by somebody he was in a white supremacy gang, and he works with the son of a Sikh who was killed in a terrible attack last year, and the two of them are joined together. Should be enemies, and now working together. And I'm working with this school through Skype, and there's 70 young people who are all creating peace-building projects, and they're all they're not talking about it, but they are forgiving, they are bridge building, they are changing their communities, they are working with their feelings, they are working with forgiveness. It's all put into projects to help their communities. And I do think any work we do with young people has to be about supporting them to create the projects they want to do, to be change makers. And I believe all young people can be change makers. There's also something there about justice and how actually we do change the world. I don't believe that our prison system or punitive justice changes anything, but just keeps things the same. I'm very passionate that within us all there is that ability to transform what life gives us. It might involve forgiveness, it might not. I don't think that actually matters. But that transformation is possible, and that we all have our own way. I know there's loads of different ways, and it's about making sure people have the resources and the support. I could not have done what I've done without some incredibly important workshops and places I went to where I was just listened to, without anyone trying to say, haven't you let go, or you should be feeling this, but just that listening, that acknowledging is just so important to be able to move on. So every time I'm asked to speak about forgiveness, which is often, because I'm sort of seen as an expert, but I really don't think I am, the first thing I say is one of those things that I'm going to carry on learning, for the rest of my life. And actually the person who's taught me most is actually Pat McGee, which is just, extraordinary. Okay, thank you.
I realised that I'd never, ever taught a lesson specifically with the subject title forgiveness. And was, I suppose, wondering why this would be the case. And I think there are always reasons for these things. I mean, one of them is that within the long history of religious education in this country, there have always been disputes and controversies, which one of which was about, obviously, particularly about doctrine. And there was always a fear, this is going back a long way now, into the 1920s perhaps, that doctrine was too divisive. For example, the doctrine of the atonement, and people would have very different views about it, and so it was thought best to concentrate on simply telling stories from the Bible. Of course, you could then just say, well, it depends from what point of view. Anyway, the Bible became quite central to religious education. But of course, as soon as you start doing that, you do find yourself into stories of forgiveness and rage and resentment, etc., which may again raises another pedagogical question as to whether we should approach these things directly or indirectly. I mean, was I in fact more effective in my teaching by not teaching forgiveness? I know the point I really wanted to make was when we did get onto the whole issue of forgiveness and justice, the class would very much come alive, and it is a very powerful, as you will know, it's a powerfully emotive thing and something that children very easily engage with. And what I used to do, if, for example, we had this, which is often known as the parable of the prodigal son, although probably wrongly to call it that, but we would go through the story and I would encourage them to choose a character, because a lot of them felt very sorry for the older brother and felt that he was very hard done by. And so I would let them choose which character they wanted to take and to tell their story from that point of view. So that could be a good pedagogy.
Well, first of all, the teacher's got to have the intention of teaching forgiveness. I mean, if the intention isn't there, it probably won't be done, whether directly or indirectly. Second thing I've learned, narratives are a very important part of the teaching, because you give pupils a view of what's possible, and a first-person narrative is the most powerful of all in terms of getting children to engage with this narrative. So we've learned something, if we want to teach children about forgiveness, you use narratives. Teachers have to have a clear intention. First-person narratives is absolutely fundamental, or at least very helpful. So, in terms of pedagogy, we need to think, well, actually, okay, we want forgiveness. How do we do it? How do we do it? We've heard some modeling, narrative, stories as a way of engaging children. I mean, if people have other suggestions, I want to hear them at some point.
Is when you do give that space and when you do support it strongly, there is very rarely a young person left in the room at the end of the day who isn't saying, wow, I'd never thought about that before, how important this is in my life. And suddenly that lens is just changing. Now that doesn't mean they're all saying, I forgive you. It's just they've taken some very important tool into their life, which they're then able to use in the next situation they walk into.